widely to everybody concerned. Again, apologies for the delay in commencing with this broadcast. One of those teething problems of trying to integrate two accounts. But we are here and we are now running. And the topic for today's discussion is, in fact, the President's plan, the President's economic stimulus plan. So please feel free to unmute your microphone if you want to make a point or ask a question. And also, please note that it would be great if whatever is said could be located within the framework of, I suppose, the engineering sector generally, but the corrosion sector in particular. So the 6 points that are going to be dealt with, the question is, what can we as Corrisa and what can corrosion as a sector of industries, be they the manufacturing sector, the retail sector, the distribution and import sector, and then importantly, the consulting and the training components of the sector, as well as the applicator component of the sector. What can we do in answer to the President's call on the 6 points of stimulus? If anything, even if it's just an indication that we're ready, corrosion practitioners are ready to respond to the call, and this is what we'd like to do in conjunction with the President's office in terms of making a plan like this a reality. For those of you who don't know, my name is Ivor Blumenthal, and I'm a consultant to Corrisa for this purpose. I hope you can all hear me. If you can't hear me and I can't hear you, then please just send a message on chat and I will see it on the screen and we can commence that way. So everybody knows this guy. He is President Cyril Ramaphosa, and the stimulus and recovery plan, which we are outlining, consists of a range of measures, both financial and non-financial, to be implemented immediately with the intention of igniting economic activity, restoring investor confidence, preventing further job losses, creating new jobs, and specifically responding to vulnerable groups. So it's a very noble plan, but the question is whether this plan will, in fact, have the effect of being able to ignite the kind of economic regeneration which obviously is intended to be ignited by a plan like this. The measures give priority to areas of economic activity having the greatest impact on youth, women, and small businesses. So Nomagugu, you recently ran a program specifically directed towards women in business, and specifically women in the metallurgy and corrosion sector. And so as a result, you would be able, as I suppose UJ, as I suppose Total Contamination, and also with TIA, which is the Technology and Investment Agency, you would be able to say to the President, we've started something in relation to women and small business, and youth, in fact. We think we can go a lot further. Can I just ask you, Nomagugu, have you had formal feedback on whether or not TIA consider the project that you implemented a success or not?
We've had a representative from TIA coming to do a profile so they could put us in our magazine and maybe use it as an example to other technology stations. But they have said that it's a success and they haven't had a project of this kind. They've never had one like this. They have not said anything about funding it for a second phase, but they were very impressed and pleased with the results.
I think the important thing then is possibly in association with Corrisa to contact TIA and to say to TIA that in response to the President's economic stimulus plan, and as we go through the presentation now, we'll try and find you specifically the component of that plan that you can talk to, but that through Corrisa and through Total Contamination or Quick Labs and UJ even, that you would like to then ratchet that program that you ran. How many women? There were about 10 or 11 women involved, right?
10, including 11, including me.
Okay, so that you'd like to ratchet that up into a fully blown and full-scale program across the sector because of course what you're doing is creating small businesses which can then be engaged with by companies as suppliers, and particularly black-owned supplier businesses and black female-owned supplier businesses, which is exactly what the president's plan is talking to. So that is very definitely something that we could pursue. And Donovan, thank you for joining us. I see from your point of view, that would obviously be something which positions Corrisa well in terms of this plan, based on the fact that the deputy president of Corrisa, and in fact the next president of Corrisa, is the person who was driving that woman in corrosion plan. Donovan, I see you there. So if you do want to talk, just unmute your microphone. Thanks. All right. So let's move on then. So the stimulus and recovery plan has 5 broad parts. Sorry, Donovan, you were saying?
I'm back.
You're back. Thank you.
Yeah, I was saying that is Norma Gugu involved in the meeting, and is Greg also involved in the meeting?
Norma Gugu is here. Norma Gugu is here. In fact, we were just having a discussion on the subject.
Oh, I see.
So what I'm volunteering to do is, together with Hendrik, to sit down with Norma Gugu and with Greg and to contact Tia formally and say that Corrisa and Quick Labs or Total Contamination would like to ratchet up what was a very successful pilot now as a response to the president's economic stimulus plan to get more women from metallurgy into the corrosion sector. Donovan?
Yes, Avo, sorry.
Are you comfortable with that notion?
Yes, of course I'm comfortable.
Okay, good. Moving on. All right. So there are 5 elements, 5 broad parts to the stimulus and economic recovery plan. The first is growth enhancing economic reforms. The second is the reprioritization of public spending to support job creation. And I'm sure you'll know that in one way or another, the president has diverted 500 billion rand from the current budget cycle and current budget process into infrastructure development over a number of years. And the establishment of an infrastructure fund is what will flow from that, and addressing urgent and present matters in education and health. And fifthly, investing in municipal social infrastructure improvement. Now, there can be no question that if there was a sit down between Corrisa and SALGA, the South African Local Government Authority or Association, that in fact it wouldn't be that difficult convincing a local government of the need to have corrosion inspectors amongst their existing inspectorate who are members of Corrisa, and importantly, who have obtained the various qualifications, including the NACE qualifications, for purposes of municipal social infrastructure and municipal building improvement. So the important thing is how one gets into that room to have that engagement. But certainly, in terms of the president's plan, it's one of the priorities, and there is funding as well, which has been put behind this priority. So I would imagine that it's an absolutely critical thing to use this plan to get into municipal government offices to say, we want your inspectors, or at least a component of your inspectorate, to be members of Corrisa, specifically even within the local government cluster, so that we can work with them in terms of their original qualifications, which are NACE qualifications, then in terms of their professional recognition, and finally in terms of the quality assurance through CPD activities of the work that they're doing. It's an opportunity which is there for the begging. So in terms of growth enhancing economic reforms, well, we've seen an attempt by government to clean up the travel control over children traveling. The jury is out whether the efforts and the measures have been effective or not, because there's a lot of confusion out there. But certainly there's been an attempt to clean that up. The list of countries requiring visas to enter South Africa will be reviewed. And certainly the intention is to have visa entry or visa-free entry agreements with many countries around the world. And here we talk about China, we talk about India, we talk about Brazil. And then obviously we talk as well about countries on the African continent. An e-visa pilot will be implemented, and the visa requirements for highly skilled foreigners will be revised. Now, here again, I think that there is an investigation that needs to be conducted by Corrisa to determine whether the notion of a highly skilled person is something which can be defined as far as corrosion is concerned by Corrisa, where a memorandum of agreement then is sought with the Department of Home Affairs so that before they let people who claim to be corrosion practitioners, either manufacturers or practitioners or consultants or trainers or applicators, into the country, some clearing activity would need to be taking place by Corrisa, who would then present a certificate to those individuals so that Department of Home Affairs could then act under this visa requirement adjustment under the economic reform component of the president's plan. I don't know if any discussions have taken place up until now. Donovan, perhaps you do. Graham, perhaps you do. But if someone wants to come into the country with a corrosion qualification or to do a job in corrosion, is there any interaction that the Department of Home Affairs requires from Corrisa? Anybody want to comment on that? Anyone had experience with that? I can tell you that as far as paint is concerned and paint chemists are concerned, that is the role that SAPMA plays. That Department of Home Affairs comes through SAPMA for the, if you want, the professional certification of an individual who wants to come into the country before they grant a visa for that person to work in South Africa. The contact center sector do exactly the same thing. So there are a number of sectors that have those agreements with the Department of Home Affairs, and it just positions that association at the forefront of an industry. And I think it's the kind of activity that should automatically be entered into. If you do have any comments or observations, please feel free to make them. So other economic reforms being considered are, for example, the approving the revised mining charter, which was in fact done, and it seems that all the social partners are now happy with that mining charter. The Mineral and Petroleum Resource Development Act Amendment Bill, which was being delayed, is being fast-tracked through Parliament. A separate regulation of the oil and gas industry drafted by government. Now, when it comes to the oil and gas industry, there are certainly chemicals and corrosion products that would fall either under petroleum resources or oil and gas. And so it would be important, I think, for Corrisa to indicate to the powers that be that Corrisa wants to be part of that engagement process so that you don't find yourself on the back end of a legislation or a regulation drive, which in fact regulates how you do business, what products you use, what processes you apply, without your knowing it. And again here, I suppose, Don, I have to address the question to you. Has there been any interaction either with the government departments such as Trade and Industry or Mineral Resources and Energy to actually position Corrisa when it comes to products and processes which might be imported into South Africa?
We haven't had any talks yet, Ivor. I know that Hendrik has been liaising with an individual at the DTR, but that hasn't progressed into an actual meeting.
And from a manufacturing point of view, no discussions?
We do have discussions with RTAC, but not the DTR, no.
All right, because when it comes to imports and import restrictions and duties as well, you obviously want to be on top of that. One way or the other. And I would imagine you'd want a seat at that table as well, particularly when it impacts on imports, on incentives, et cetera, that DTI are continuously working on. You see, what the president has done here, what the president is saying is that we want a renewed, invigorated engagement with industry to make sure that we can create a trading framework which best suits those players in industry. So I think it's critically important, and I hope you'll agree, it's critically important that in a response to the president's plan, Corrisa's letter to the president's office would be, we are ready to take charge of this aspect of it on behalf of the corrosion sector.
100%.
Dave, I see you wanted to say something.
Yeah, we started some ex officio discussions with DTI and some of the ex-members of the DTI. So that it's fairly well advanced, but I didn't know you guys were doing something. This is a parallel activity that we started.
So it's my recommendation that something gets done, because Don, correct me if I'm wrong, but outside of the exploratory talks, it's still in its infancy and early days. So Dave, maybe there's an opportunity to have an integrated kind of a relationship. And please, I'm not putting words into anyone's mouth, but an integrated relationship rather than a separate relationship with these government departments.
Absolutely,
Yeah, sure.
I think it's vitally important.
Well, we can set up a meeting after this meeting, Avo, to discuss it further with Dave.
Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is hot tip galvanizing, right?
No. Cathodic protection, my side.
Oh, sorry, man. Sorry. I get the guys mixed up. Cathodic protection. Okay. All right. So I will set up an activity that I can facilitate there. Apologies for that. Okay. Moving on. To reduce the cost of doing business, to boost exports, and to make South African industry more competitive, government has begun a review of various prices, administrated prices, starting with electricity, port, and rail tariffs. And they've already given an indication to the Environmental Control Council that they want to take it into chemicals. They want to take it into partly finished product and completely finished imported product as well. When it comes to the chemical sector, when it comes to manufacturing, engineering, and technology. So they've already started with each of these points here and the other economic reforms in terms of the president's plan. So I think it's critically important to highlight to those government departments that are facilitating these discussions that Corrisa should be considered a stakeholder when it comes to products being utilized within the corrosion sector. Government initiates a process for the allocation of high demand. Okay, don't worry about that. That's radio and broadcasting, and ultimately broadband and cell phones and data costs. So government are working very actively in that regard. Government are intending to put a lot of funding, but importantly, from a tendering point of view, a lot of prioritization into procurement from small businesses and cooperatives in line with triple BEE. And so the reality is this, and I can tell you, and I'm quoting the registrar, the triple BEE registrar here, or maybe I shouldn't be quoting, so these are my words. The reality is that there's not going to be any QSE or large generic company which doesn't satisfy the minimum criteria of 40% on procurement with small businesses, not only in terms of products, but in terms of sharing processes, which will be entitled then to earn those triple BEE. So SANAT, which accredits the rating agencies, are already in the process of drawing up a guideline for rating agencies to more closely monitor who those small business suppliers are that companies are seeking to get triple BEE procurement points for in their triple BEE verification. And that goes for manufacturers, it goes for service providers, and it also goes for consultants who might be required to have a BEE status. So that's a very, very important factor, which is almost hidden in the president's plan, expanding procurement from small businesses and cooperatives. The Black Management Council or the Black Management Federation would have liked to have seen a target of 70% of procurement being from level 1 and level 2 businesses. That's what they initially tabled. The business community has moderated it down, but it is important that it factors very much in 45 out of 109 points. It factors very, very much in triple BE verification, and people ignore it at their peril. I think that's a very important consideration. Using trade measures within World Trade Organization rules to protect poultry and other sensitive sectors, and vigorous crackdown on illegal imports. Don, can I ask you this? And you're certainly the one who would be able to comment on it. But as far as the legality and illegality of imports and product distribution, as far as corrosion product is concerned into South Africa, is it under control, or is it one of those things that isn't tracked and isn't researched sufficiently? Oh, Don's offline. Dave, maybe I can ask you.
There seems to be no guidance. It's very difficult to find your import codes for some sectors, and much of it does not exist.
So my assumption,
you fudge it and you put it under another import code or whatever.
So my assumption is then you'd be bringing the product in under the coatings code rather than corrosion code.
You're bringing it in under any available tariff sector, but it doesn't cover the spectrum of cathodic protection. I don't know about coatings, but in cathodic protection, it's pretty much carte blanche, then mixed up with other categories of industry.
Right. So I suppose the question has to be, and this is something Corrisa will have to grapple with, but does it want to get involved in, if you, not, it's wrong for me to say the regulation of imports, but does it want to get involved in how imports are regulated and how distribution is regulated in the country? That becomes a challenge to Corrisa that Corrisa will have to debate and will have to then decide upon, because it is a double-edged sword. You will find Corrisa members that say we're quite happy the way things are, potentially unregulated. And then you will find others who say, well, it's unfair competition and therefore we need more regulation. But that is certainly a debate that the president's plan is sparking in most industries in South Africa.
If the plan is to develop our own economy in South Africa, one of the observations that I've made with my various travels to the States over the years is that the magnesium, zinc, sacrificial anode type people are diminishing in the States because of lack of restriction of import. So those old companies like Galfco and places like that, they don't exist anymore. They've been closed down, obviously through environmental laws as well as imports. And them obviously being a local manufacturer, they suffer under the Chinese import.
And do we know the impact of that in the corrosion sector?
Well, in the American corrosion sector, there's a number of players that have now disappeared off the industry. So obviously, the local suppliers in the States have shrunk in number.
And then presumably there would be a mirror of that here in South Africa, possibly even more because of our relationship with China.
Absolutely, but at one stage there were people that made anodes in South Africa. Whether they're good or bad, I don't think that's the question. But those people no longer exist. No anodes are manufactured in South Africa, whereas once we did do manufacturing locally.
Very, very important discussion. Okay, so the central element of the economic stimulus and recovery plan is the reprioritization of spending towards activities that have the greatest impact on economic growth, domestic demand, and job creation, with a particular emphasis on township and rural economies, women, and the youth. So these are all the pressure points. The greatest impact on economic growth, domestic demand, job creation, township and rural economies, women, and the youth. If Corrisa is establishing a policy in response to the president's plan, these would be its nodes. Can one focus on growing the corrosion sector and therefore impact on the economy, impact on domestic demand, and that you've just answered one of the points in terms of product formulation, and then importantly, impact in terms of job creation, i.e. more inspectors, more applicators, etc., etc. And is that something that could be done in township and rural areas, or does it have to be done in urban areas? If it was done in township and rural areas, so that those companies that were setting up in those townships and those rural IDZs, if you want, were benefiting from tax breaks, from tax holidays, from supply side incentive programs from DTI, it might become quite a encouraging way to look at enticing or making attractive the growth in the corrosion sector. This is not the place for the debate. This is the place to say that debate should take place, and how it takes place is at Corrisa's facilitation. So the second thing now is reprioritizing public spending for job growth. Our government has limited fiscal space to increase spending on borrowing, so it can't borrow. So it needs to take the money that it's got and make the money go further. Use it, take it away from, if you want, the corruption and the capture element to the deployment and to the operational application element. So the president, and I must say, I actually have a lot of respect for those people in the presidency that have done this. But they've looked at the current budget and they've reprioritized funding, directing that funding towards investments in agriculture and economic activities where they're most needed in terms of township and rural areas. The one important thing about the president's plan is this. It acknowledges, and this is very important, it acknowledges that local government does not have the capacity to properly capacitate townships and rural areas. That you can't use your income base from rates and taxes and basically simply take that money and put it into your, in Johannesburg, for example, into your Sowetos and your Alexandras and your Tembises at the expense of the areas where the people live who pay those rates and taxes actually live in. And that's been the problem over the last 20 years. You've seen services and infrastructure being eroded in your traditional rates and tax paying areas for the benefit of your townships and rural areas. What the president's plan is recognizing is that unless this is a national effort to enhance township and rural infrastructure capacitation, service and resource capacitation, it's never going to happen at the pace that society demands it. So I think that's a very positive and a very important acknowledgement that comes from the president's plan. So it's putting money into agriculture, and we don't need to spend too much time on the agricultural plan. Safe to say that obviously corrosion factors in to the farming community in terms of equipment, in terms of water infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. So in the very first element of reprioritizing of public spending, Corrisa is in a position to send up a flag to the presidency that when it comes to the quality assurance of the work that is done on piping, on infrastructure, on machinery, and on equipment, corrosion should be one of those non-negotiables. And Corrisa wants to play a role in the application of an anti-corrosion combating framework, which is taken up within the agricultural sector. And there will be funding for that based on the reprioritization of the funding and public spending that the president's plan has indicated. So that's a very, very important consideration. As far as land reform is concerned, we don't need to spend too much time on the president's plan in terms of what it says about land reform, except to say that there's a 10-people commission headed by the Deputy President, David Mabuza, in that regard. So as far as township and rural areas is concerned, the plan says we will put a certain amount of that 500 billion rand into townships and rural areas as long as the private community are able to come to the party, so we can ignite activities in township and rural areas and somehow control the urbanization that's taking place in every province throughout South Africa. It's a noble plan. The real question is, how do you change a culture rather than necessarily just how do you implement economic innovation? So they've prioritized the revitalization of 3 regional and 26 township industrial parks. Those parks already exist, but they've been allowed to go to rack and ruin. And so the Department of Trade and Industries, together with Public Works, have said, let's take 3 of those regional and 26 of those township industrial parks, and let's try revitalize them. Let's make them into economic and industrial zones within those townships and those rural areas. And let's create the kind of tax incentives and trading corridors that would be attractive to businesses to set up there rather than in your traditional urban areas. Any thoughts, Graham, from your point of view in Cape Town, but any thoughts on whether or not this focus will have any sort of impact or any kind of influence on businesses in terms of where they set up and where they trade from?
Any idea where the 3 regional ones are going to be? And
no, not so much that, not where they're going to be, but whether or not you think by government creating these opportunities for the private sector, companies, for example, such as your own, would be attracted to move out of, let's call them urban areas, into rural and township industrial parks and areas where you might get a better tax deal, where you might get or you might get relaxations in terms of labor relations and employment conditions, etc., etc. Do you think that is a likelihood?
I think it is. I mean, my brother's company is based in Atlantis, and yeah, I mean, the reason why it's there is because of the incentives of Atlantis being a business park where they put in fiber early and et cetera, et cetera. So I think, yeah, I think it's a, I think just for general public and sort of the general person, if they see that government's making an effort and creating these business parks, then it's good for the buoyancy of people's thinking about the economy, even if the economy is not necessarily doing fantastically well.
If someone had to say to me, choose one area in South Africa where a Corrisa relationship would be piloted, I would recommend a place like Kucha in Port Elizabeth, where I would say that because the motor industry is there and there's such a high degree of corrosion focus within the motor manufacturing sector, it would be a perfect place then to set up a relationship with, or seek a relationship with Kucha, where you are in fact able then to implement projects of a corrosion or a Corrisa nature and benefit from prioritized public spending in an area like that, even to the extent of then trying to entice and invite companies to participate in that process. So I hope you all agree it's worth focusing on.
Yeah, I do. I bet just quickly, are we going to be getting a copy of this presentation by email or?
So, sorry, can I just ask you, Leslie, just to mute your microphone? Thank you. Just to mute your microphone, Leslie. Thank you. Until you need to talk or ask a question, then please unmute it. So in answer to your question, Graham, you will get the presentation, but you will also get an invitation to the link of this recording. So you'll be able to listen to this recording or view it on YouTube.
Yeah, thanks. I have listened to previous recordings and they are pretty good quality. So
Excellent.
thanks.
Thank you. All right. So a township and rural entrepreneurship fund is being established to provide finance to either scale up existing projects or provide startup capital for new projects. Now, Nomagugu, and I'm just checking if you're still on the line. I think from your point of view, in terms of those small businesses that you created under the Tia Women's Project, I think it is a perfect opportunity for you to look at that and say, there is a fund which is being created for township and rural entrepreneurship. If you've got a business, either a corrosion consulting business or a manufacturing business or an applicator business in the field of corrosion, and you're able to say to those township administrators, local government, and to your rural entrepreneurship hubs, we want to play a role as Corrisa with you in this process. Well, you've got the president saying that that fund has now been created. And I think it needs to be a massive priority of yours to see how you can become a partner to leverage the reprioritized spending for those funds to your members, who are in fact the people who are graduating from UJ out of metallurgy or corrosion, etc., etc. So it might very well be that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is it Corriso, which is the student organization, that Nomagugu, Corriso, Hendrik as the CEO of Corrisa should be sitting down and should be saying, how can we take these projects that have been done in the past, how can we now take them into the future, into the townships and the rural areas from an entrepreneurship development point of view? Because the president's proposal is talking directly to you and to that as an opportunity. It is not something you want to pass up, I don't think. Okay. Now we come to the big money. Establishing an infrastructure fund. Establishing expansion and maintenance, the potential to create jobs on a large scale, attract investment, and lay a foundation for sustainable economic expansion. Reduce fragmentation of infrastructure spend. And the private sector is invited to enter into meaningful partnerships with government in this fund. That's an open invitation. And again, from a quality assurance perspective, as far as corrosion is concerned, it is an invitation I would suggest to you cannot be left without answering, because they're saying to you, quality assurance is something this fund can fund as long as there is a proposal and it is pervasive. It is rural, it is township, it is not just urban in terms of its focus. And as long as we can create jobs out of a project like that, as long as by doing it, because we've got quality assurance, we're attracting investment. No question in my mind that if Corrisa does that, it will be an investment attracting activity. And from an economic expansion point of view, Corrisa being able to say that if we start with 10 businesses, we could end up with 100 businesses. So it's really about, I suppose, the viability of the research that Corrisa is sitting on as to whether or not that's practical. There's 400 billion rand that the president, 400 billion rand that the president is moving out of the budget, and into this infrastructure fund. So you know now that if you make a proposal on quality assurance of material and of processes and of machinery and equipment, you know that you can make that proposal to this infrastructure fund. And if it's early enough, you can secure for corrosion companies, you can secure a part of that allocation for quality assurance purposes. When are you ever going to get an invitation like this coming around again? You have to look at it like that, ladies and gentlemen. So there is an infrastructure execution team in the presidency called the PICC, which will identify and quantify shovel-ready project sector projects, such as roads and dams, and engage the private sector to manage delivery, focusing on improved coordination across the three spheres, be they local, provincial, and national government. So that's your go-to place as Corrisa to start, to approach the infrastructure execution team, the PICC, and to say to them, we represent quality assurance, we represent project planning, we represent extended life cycle of product, of machinery, and of equipment, and we want to play a pivotal role leveraging for our members a place in this discussion. So just an indication of the types of projects: provincial, national, human settlement, water infrastructure, schools, student accommodation, public transport. Corrisa stands up very, very importantly in almost all of those projects which have been identified as initial example projects in the President's plan. The Industrial Development Corporation will be targeting to increase its approvals to 20 billion over 12 months, an increase of 20% on the previous year. Again, Nomagugu, I point to you, the people who are incubating new businesses in metallurgy and in the place of corrosion, be they consulting businesses, product businesses, innovation businesses, or applicator businesses. And you've got this indication now from the Industrial Corporation that they're going to push up their allocations and their approvals by 20% to meet the President's plan. So they're telling you we've got 20 billion rand we're setting aside for new businesses that need Industrial Development Corporation funding. When are you ever going to get a better opportunity than this coming along for that purpose? That's the question. The funding will target the productive sectors of the economy, including manufacturing, mining, industrial infrastructure, and sectors also in distress. I mean, this is corrosion. Okay, don't worry too much about health and education. I mean, I don't mean don't worry about it, but for purposes of this discussion, don't worry too much about that, except, I suppose, to look at the infrastructure projects around public facilities of health and education, and saying that Corrisa can put up its hands and say, we want to play a role in the quality of the infrastructure in health and education. And I don't see them saying no to you in that regard, because it's really about inspecting facilities, it's upgrading facilities from a corrosion perspective and coating perspective, etc. And that should be music to their ears in terms of the competitiveness of those health and those education assets that they need to extend the lifespan of. I hope you can still all hear me, because everyone has gone absolutely quiet.
Ira?
Yes?
I know Leslie sent a message saying he's got no sound. I don't know if it's just a technical issue on his side, or, yeah, I mean, I can hear you fine.
Okay, fantastic. Leslie, we will be sending out a link to the this discussion. So you'll be able to then listen to that link if you can't hear us now. I hope you can hear us though. Okay. Okay. Now this is squarely Corrisa's space. Municipal infrastructure investment. 57 priority pilot municipalities. Obviously, the president is talking more to the management and the governance of those municipalities. But when it comes to the quality assurance, when it comes to the competency of the inspectors in the building and the planning divisions of those municipalities, it is a perfect invitation for Corrisa to put up its hand and say, we want to take ownership of those people who work in that sector. We want to take ownership of those people. We want to take ownership of if not the entire makeup of the inspector, then at least that element of their makeup that has to do with corrosion and anti-corrosion certification and quality assurance. I mean, the funding is there, the focus is there, the prioritization is there. There's never been a better time to establish the bona fides of Corrisa and the corrosion sector than now, as far as I'm concerned. The spending will cover sewage purification and reticulation, refuse sites, electricity reticulation, water reservoirs. I mean, it is an absolute tabula rasa. It is a blank page for Corrisa to play with. So across what the president had to say is this: cutting across all these measures are a series of interventions to ensure that growth is labor intensive and that young people in particular are drawn into the labor market. It's very difficult. This is more an aspiration. I think it's more a philosophy than a practical plan, because as we know, every industry, bar none, are becoming more and more capital intensive and less labor intensive. And so the question is, whatever the plan is, can one satisfy the president and his office that there is a labor creation, a labor absorption, a labor beneficiation element to your projects? I think you need to consider whether or not you can say that without being disingenuous. Possibly in terms of quality assurance and corrosion quality assurance, it's the kind of sector that will remain more labor intensive than capital intensive for longer. But there is equally no question that drones, in-pipe drones, external drones, overhead drones are very, very quickly taking on a scanning and a survey role within corrosion protection activities. And so I'd imagine that the genuine answer back to the presidency would be, we can create technical jobs, but we're not certain whether we can create labor-intensive positions of the scale you might want to see created. And again, it's not a rhetorical statement. It's a question. Do you think that corrosion can become more of a labor-intensive industry than it is currently? Because if you do, then that is obviously going to be music to the ears of the presidency. Again, Dave, if I can ask you and Graham to comment on that.
What we have seen is the vandalism, the magnitude of the vandalism in the country is making some water boards shut down in terms of applying labor to their pipelines and so on. So where we saw large water boards doing work on their pipelines, largely because of no hospitals, those kind of things in those rural type areas, these people are battling to find labor. They are battling to actually get people to stay and to do the work. So it's quite a quandary, unfortunately.
That's a very good comment you've just made. What you're saying is that the positions are there. It's just that the people and the qualified people are not there sufficiently to fill those positions.
That's correct. Some water institutions have gone from like 15 players down to 1.
Well, that is music to the ears of the presidency, because then the organizations like Cathodic Protection, like Corrisa, etc., are in a position to say, we want funding to put together a plan to be able to fill those positions, those labor positions that are there, instead of replacing them with technology, or both, a plan to do both.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
it's actually saying to government, here is a priority area. There are just too many positions that haven't been filled because technically there are not enough qualified people out there. We would like the funding to put together a project to start to address those deficiencies.
Absolutely.
That's a fantastic observation. Thank you for that, Dave. Graham, from your side, I suppose in your area of application, would you say that corrosion is still one of those areas which could remain labor intensive for a period of time?
We've talked about this on a number of occasions because of our training that the Corrosion Institute offers, and that maybe the training we offer is too high level, and that we need to incorporate a whole lot more lower level, sort of the labor intensive type training options, paint applicators and things like that. So yeah, I mean, if there's funding from the government to support that, then I think we certainly encourage more youngsters to be part of the whole process.
This plan is saying exactly that. It is saying specifically, you bring us labor intensive plans where there is an industry and a sectoral buy into those plans, and we will put the money behind the project. Nomagugu, from your point of view, what is interesting, I think, is that on the Women Project that you facilitated, a number of those companies which were envisaged by the participating students, a number of those companies were in fact labor intensive companies. They weren't capital intensive companies. Would you agree with that or not?
That's 50-50. So,
for example, there was the waste.
they were not all really.
There was waste treatment. There was the survey and scanning businesses. So I would imagine that there were people, particularly those who were looking to go back into the township and the rural areas to set up their businesses, who were prepared to look at labor-intensive options. And so I think, Graham, from your point of view, what's very interesting here is to almost talk about Corrisa convening an indaba around the opportunity to create labor-intensive work within the corrosion sector to complement the capital-intensive and technology-intensive work that is currently being done. It might become a great opportunity, I think, for a focus on a labor-intensive strategy, which might even eventually be a strategy that says that if there was a charter council for coating and corrosion and applications, that charter council might look at triple B incentives for companies around labor intensity rather than just around capital intensity. There are already those incentives built into triple B regulations and scorecards, but from an application point of view, it just gives you a completely new and novel focus. So without belaboring the point, I think it's well worth us recommending to Corrisa to initiate this kind of a indaba, if you want, on the labor-intensive opportunities within corrosion, particularly amongst asset owners, and in particular sectors like the defense sector, to look at those opportunities seriously. Would you agree with that, Graham, or would you say it's taking you on a trajectory where your members don't want to go because your members want to move more and more towards capital-intensive focuses? It's a question. It wasn't a rhetorical statement.
Yeah, I think you talk about indaba. I think it's worth sort of getting people around the table and talking about it. But yeah, from my side, it's more the concentrating on the corrosion training courses and sort of getting more sort of aiming the training more at lower level youth as opposed to high level sort of graduates, which I guess NACE is more aimed towards.
That's a good point, though, because here's a question to you. Is NACE in its simplest form, is NACE capital intensive or is it labor intensive or is it neutral? In other words, is it about the application of the human capacity or the technological capacity, or is it neutral?
I guess they do have a range of courses, but I think the ones that are pushed by the Corrosion Institute, and probably the more popular ones, are probably more capital intensive than labor intensive.
Okay. All right. So look, it's a worthwhile focus, I think, particularly if for such an Indaba, there can be a partnership through the president's office for the funding of those kinds of activities, so that you can draw in possibly even international practitioners and international speakers on the subject. It could be a very worthwhile project to initiate, couldn't it?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. So this is one of the most immediate actions that the president took. He announced that the employment tax incentive, which has been going for 5 years now, ends February 2019, will be extended until 2029 with a review every 5 years. The threshold of the employment tax incentive has been increased to 8,000 Rand from the original 5 or 6,000 Rand. So government are serious about allowing you to use your PAYE money to supplement labor creation and the support of manpower in your businesses, so that your headcount numbers increase. If you don't know, the employment tax incentive allows you to take 1,000 Rand per individual for the total value of the PAYE you'd ordinarily pay over to SARS, and divert that into an ETI initiative, which is either supplementing a additional person in your company in terms of their salary, or using that 1,000 Rand a month to pay for a training program, or both for those individuals. So it is a massive opportunity. And as I say, the first 5 years is coming to an end at the end of February 2019, being used very well and very effectively out there. What it also does is allow companies to reduce their skills development expenditure bill and use SARS, if you want, to be paying part of that bill. So it's a very useful thing. Greater support for public employment programs. Look, that's a social engineering reality. When there are no jobs, then the public sector needs to create jobs to absorb people who are otherwise unemployed. So the president is saying, we don't anticipate this jobs problem getting resolved anytime soon. So we're going to need to see a bigger public sector employment of people out there, which now then tells you that the wage bill of the public sector is then set to go up, even though we've got our Minister of Finance and our Minister of, what is Pravin Gordhan? Minister of Local Government, I suppose, Cooperative Government. But even though we've got them saying they want to reduce the public sector wage bill, you've got the president plan saying we need to make provision to increase it or give it more support, because there are many, many more people out of work. We hear today that it's close to 28% real unemployment in South Africa. The statistics have come out this morning. That's 28% out of every 100 people who are able to work, who are qualified to work, who are unemployed. That's massive. When you compare that, in Europe, the average is about 8%, and in the United States, it's actually in the region of 1 to 2%. So it's massive to say 28% in South Africa. Now, obviously, because Ibrahim Patel is our Minister of Economic Affairs, or whatever he is, and he comes from the clothing and textile sector, and he basically wrote the president's plan. So obviously, we're seeing greater support for this one sector, clothing and textile, while there are hundreds of other sectors which are not mentioned in the president's plan. I think that's just a little bit of bias coming through, and one would expect it from that kind of a minister. But I suppose, if nothing else, it's in keeping with his trade union in clothing and textile background, and then the work he's done in his department since he's been minister. The use of funds from the Unemployment Insurance Fund to support labor activation programs, and particularly the Youth Employment Service. For those of you who don't know, ladies and gentlemen, the Youth Employment Service says this to a company: if you increase your headcount over a 12-month period by a target, and there are different ways of setting a target, and at the end of that 12-month period you employ 2.5% of the target, then in fact you're entitled to jump a triple BEE level So if you're a 5, you become a 4. If you're a 6, you become a 5. And importantly, if you double your target and you employ 5% of that double target, you can jump 2 triple BE levels. So if you're a 5, you can jump to a 3, or if you're a 3, you can jump to a 1. It's a massive, massive, massive incentive, particularly for companies which are traditionally white-owned, which do not have good triple BE ownership in place. This is a massive way of avoiding, I suppose, anything other than the basics of ownership in terms of jumping up the triple BE calendar all the way through to level 1. So yes is very, very important. And in fact, we intend to have a separate one of these information sessions on yes, on the regulations around yes, and how you can benefit as a company from that. So subsequent announcements about yes is that the age threshold of ETI has been extended for 10 years. The age threshold of ETI has been increased from 18 to 35 as opposed to 18 to less than 35 previously. The threshold has been increased from 6,000 to 8,000. So now anyone earning up to 8,000 Rand a month, you can do an ETI for, which is an employment tax incentive PAYE deduction for. You redirect PAYE money at 1,000 Rand per beneficiary to be used in association with your yes targets. Good. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen, you'd like to ask or address at this point in time about what's been presented? All right. Good. Well, thank you so much. Again, apologies for the late start, but now that we understand which one of our accounts we can use for GoToMeetings, it'll be flawless from here on. But thank you, everybody, for participating, and I hope you got some use out of this presentation.
Thanks, Ira. It was good.
Thank you, Ivor. Much appreciated.
Thanks, guys.